Poor mechanic impregnates a 65-year-old African billionaire. The rumor arrived like a thrown stone, and every ripple it made found new mouths to feed. In the market, a woman whispered it between vegetables. At the hairdresser's, a radio host laughed it into a morning segment. In the quiet rooms of Amanda Okoro's mansion, it landed as a thin, ugly echo that never quite left. Amanda sat in the drawing room with the night pressing against the tall windows. The mansion had been built to celebrate permanence, marble floors that swallowed sound, portraits that watched as if they could remember everything for her. Tonight, the portraits only reflected the lamplight, and the rooms held a new truth Amanda had not learned to name: the ache of a future still unfolding in a body that most had already written off as relic. The pregnancy was a headline people could not resist, but to Amanda, it was the last tether she had left to a life she had fought to keep from dissolving into loneliness. She talked aloud sometimes, when the house was empty. "If you come into this world and find only silence, know I would have moved mountains." Her laugh cracked in the middle, and the room swallowed it whole. Her sister, Amaka, had not been welcome here for months. There had been words, fury set to a calendar, and then a cold banishment that left Amaka prowling at the fringes like a shadow. Amaka's face could be all warmth in public, soft voice, soft hands, the kind of comfort that settled into people so they stopped asking questions. But warmth had a cost. Amanda had learned that one night in a hospital where the bright lights burned away all pretense and revealed what Amaka had done. Still, longing is an insistent thing. Grief is a small animal that cannot be reasoned with. She reopened the house to her nephews, Chisum and Emma, because the echo of children, any children, felt like the right medicine for her nights. The decision came from the same place as the pregnancy: hunger. She did not know then that hunger could misplace its aim. Jacob was always part of the background, a mechanic by trade, oil on his palms, a man whose laugh had the humility of someone who had learned to live in the shade of other people's fortunes. He had once been everything Amanda wanted: steady hands, a ready grin, a patient love that fit the small hours of candlelit conversations in parking lots and the clatter of a garage radio. He married Miriam, and life carved them into a respectable modesty: a rented house, a son they maimed in hopes, and a debt they paid 1 month at a time. Jacob had returned to Amanda's life because he could not help himself, because sometimes love returns like a tremor, silent until it stops being so. Miriam watched him with distrust worn thin into bone. She had a life built of small certainties: tea at dawn, a job that enabled them to pay a single school fee, a marriage that refused loud crises but carried steady pain. She watched Amanda's visits with a quietness that became a kind of map for her anger. Corners marked with betrayal, edges that would eventually fray. On the night of the birth, the hospital smelled like antiseptic and exhaustion. The fluorescent lights were relentless, making veins show blue beneath the skin. Amanda's labor had been a long, slow animal that she had coaxed to the surface with the same stubbornness she had used to build companies and shore up empires. When the second cry came, urgent and defiant, it felt to everyone in the room like an answer. Amaka arrived in a hush that had been practiced. Her hands were made specifically for consolation, her voice lowered to the pitch that made people fall into confession. She wore a bracelet Amanda had given her long ago, a slender thing of silver and a small charm. In those moments, Amanda tasted the safety of a sister's presence. She allowed herself to lean on that illusion until the moment it was turned into currency. The swap was quick, because cold people are efficient. Dr. Admi had been a man with debts and a tolerance for small betrayals the size of folded envelopes. He had argued with himself in a dingy clinic room over receipts, over the size of fines and fees, and decided with the same tired logic he used to fix broken things: a small error here for a larger relief there. The money passed as neatly as someone sliding cash under a tray. Amaka moved like a rehearsal, words offered in a cadence that suggested worry, hands that steadied a newborn that wasn't Amanda's. A second infant was whispered into a blanket and taken out the door with the kind of anonymity a hospital affords at night. Labels were switched, names mistaken on purpose, signatures traced with a fatigue that looked like duty. Nobody screamed. That was the point. The nurse who might have noticed had been paid, the records clerk had been placated, and the man who could have refused had a ledger where the numbers were louder than ethics. It took less than an hour for a healthy boy to be carted away as an anonymous child, and for a fragile, blind infant to be presented in a bundle and labeled as Amanda's. Amanda left the hospital that night, hollowed and convinced that the little body in her arms was her own. Amakan's eyes shone with a practiced grief. She spoke of precautions, of a complicated prognosis that required patience. "We will get through this," she promised, and Amanda wanted to believe it so badly she would have swallowed any lie. The stolen, healthy child, Philip, though no name then could undo what had been done, was left farther than any compassion could find. He landed in the gray bureaucracy of St. Mary's Orphanage, a place that kept time in rationed porridge and the slow slide of laundry. It would be many years before anyone traced the thread back to the hands that had let him go. 5 years passed like running water wearing at stone. Amanda's house filled with the quiet furniture of a life trying to find balance. Peter arrived as she had been told, a child born with eyes that could not see, but with hands that learned the contours of her face the way cartographers map a country. Peter called her Mama, with a voice that had learned comfort before it had learned grief. He drew the world through sound, touch, and the small rituals she gave him. Warm milk at dusk, a lullaby hummed into a pillow, the brush of her fingers across his cheek that taught him the map of his own face. Peter was hers in every way that mattered, except for a map drawn by a stranger's hand. Amanda loved without a ledger. She taught him to name the weather by its sounds and to tell time by her mother's footsteps. He preferred the rustle of leaves to the sight of them, and he could tell which of Amanda's perfumes she had worn that day. To him, the bracelet on Amaka's wrist was the very definition of comfort. He called Amaka Aunt, the way a child names a promise. Across town, in a dormitory room that smelled of starch and the soft rot of old bread, Philip learned to survive by being clever and quiet. The orphanage walls taught him how to read faces for usefulness. He found small lessons in the margins, how to fetch water so he would be assigned the easier chores, how to speak to a visiting woman in the market so she would slip him a coin for candy. The system taught him hardness, and his hands, when not ruined by labor, learned to solve puzzles. An old radio he coaxed back to life, a torn sweater he mended with the patience of a person who must pry fortune from the seams. Chisholm watched both households, like a man studying maps to figure where he could plant a flag. He slept in Amanda's house with a grin that never reached his eyes. To the world he was devoted, an attentive nephew, and the kind of son who never required much. He spoke soft to Peter, and his hands would sometimes land with a sting disguised as a reprimand. Small cruelties are the most effective. A push that looks like a correction, a phrase that plants doubt and then pretends to uproot it. Where Amaka gave the poison, Chisholm administered it in doses. Jacob's life kept fracturing around him. He had become the kind of man who could be punched and keep his mouth shut, the sort who would take a beating for silence. He stopped coming as often. Miriam grew angrier with the calendar. Each missed visit became a tally, and every tallied absence wrote its own indictment. One night, Jacob returned home with a shirt torn at the shoulder and a story that smelled of cheap threats. "I'll fix it," he said,
fingers aching from work and bruises he tried to hide. "I'll stay away." Miriam's voice cut like something sharpened on regret. "Stay away, or leave the one who accepts punches. Choose." Her ultimatum was not elegant. It had the weight of someone who had been patient until patience became complicity. The house that Amanda had built with such care was now populated by a mess of loyalties. The walls had become an inventory of quiet betrayals, a folded blanket that would not be shaken free, photographs where people were frozen at their best. Night after night, Amanda sat and rehearsed apologies she had never given and questions she had never asked. Small incidents began to knit themselves into a pattern that made Amanda's chest cold. Peter tripped often on steps that had been built to be obstacle-free. Chisholm's watchful shadow lingered too long in doorway frames. Emma would step forward and offer a syrup for a cough, only to watch Chisholm take the credit like a thief who returns the stolen goods for praise. One afternoon, a child's scream cut the air. It was not a shriek of play. It was a sound that someone had practiced and now released, a terrible human alarm. Peter had rolled down a flight of stairs at the back of the house. He had been found at the bottom, palms up, breath shaking like leaves. They rushed him in the same hospital Amanda had once left shattered. The fluorescent lights were patient and unfeeling. The doctors did not look at names, they looked at the boy and the severity of the fall. Peter's face was streaked with blood. A bruise was blooming across his temple like an ugly flower. The emergency room tasted of steam and disinfectant. Hands moved fast, monitors beeped the precise, indifferent rhythm of possibility. Amanda sat in the corridor, palm pressed to her stomach as if the presence inside might steady her. Time dilated. Miriam arrived like a storm at the doorway, her face reddened, the sharpness of her voice cutting straight through the crowd. Jacob came later, slow and stunned, the shame of his distance hanging on him like a second clothing. At first, the doctors spoke in clipped sentences. "He's stable, but we need scans." Then, after blood work and the quick bureaucracy of modern medicine, a doctor returned with the kind of caution that dresses finality. "There's a discrepancy," the doctor said, voice careful. "We ran a basic blood compatibility test just to rule out anything critical, and the blood types are inconsistent." He set a clipboard down and met Amanda's eyes. "It doesn't prove anything by itself. In rare cases, test errors happen, but given the history you described, Mrs. Okoro, I recommend more definitive testing, DNA lineage panels. It's standard. It's the right course." Amanda's breath hitched, every muscle in her body tuned to a new frequency.
If blood could be wrong, then labels could be wrong. If labels could be wrong, then a theft might have replaced a cradle. The word DNA landed like frost. The corridor seemed suddenly full of echoes. Chisholm was there, leaning against a wall with a face that could be read in two ways, feigned concern and something else that had the smell of calculation. Emma hovered, hands in pockets, eyes darting. Amaka was not in the hospital. She had not been seen in months, and Amanda hadn't invited her. Yet the old bracelet flashed in the corner of Amanda's memory like a clue. Amanda demanded the old footage. It began as a sentence said to thin air, then became a command. There are certain things wealth buys: privacy, influence, the ability to make systems bend. Hospitals keep footage for a time. Administrators are used to calls from people with lists of names and no wasted patience. The request for footage slid through the channels because the voice that asked had a name and a reputation behind it. "It's protocol," the administrator told her, and Amanda felt the word like a hand on her throat. "We'll see what's available, Mrs. Okoro, but the footage you want dates back 5 years. We can check the archive, but there are retention policies." She had expected resistance.
She had not expected the way the hospital clerk's eyes softened with something like pity at the mention of her name. They would do it, he said. They would check. It would take time. Time had been the one currency the thieves of that night had traded in. In the meantime, Dr. Odme's name surfaced like a blister bursting. Amanda had known him by sight, an efficient sort who had never looked at her like a person, but rather an appointment. When the clerk mentioned him, it came with a careful tilt. He doesn't work here regularly anymore. He moved to private practice. The words were a thin tissue of deflection. Men like Odme were often under the weather of their own errors. Amanda remembered the night in flashes she had kept secret. The money on the tray, Amaka's hands, the new mother's exhaustion that had made her consent to anything. Memory rearranged itself, colors sharpened until the silver bracelet burned like a brand on someone's hand. She slept little that night. Each time she closed her eyes, she could feel the small weight of the boy she had left behind, and the one sleeping in her house, his hands, his way of searching the world with fingers first, pulled at her with a love that had no proof. Chisam's behavior became testy. He called to Jacob with a voice edged in warning. "You stay away," he told him once, and Jacob's face went pale because that voice had more than menace. It had the authority of someone who had learned to make others exist in fear. The fall was a shuddering thing that stretched possibilities thin. It raised questions that had been smoldering like embers. Why was Peter at that stair? Who too often left doors open? Why had no one seen a bruise before? Amanda's maternal certainty began to fray into something sharper and more precise: suspicion. Amanda's world, which had once been managed by lawyers and signatures and perfectly balanced accounts, now smelled of small betrayals and old money tucked into envelopes. She had used her power sparingly. She had hoped tenderness could be purchased as easily as a hush. The difference was that hush sometimes buys worse than silence. It buys a comfort that lets evil entertain itself unobserved. She asked to speak to security. The head of hospital security agreed to show her what was possible. CCTV, the invisible eye, had been a constant in her business dealings. She had once negotiated footage for a boardroom scandal with the same patience she now felt walking into a building that now seemed to hold an ocean of small lies. They were reluctant, procedural, polite. "Records are archived," they said. "We'll make inquiries, but—" The "but" was implied, like a closed mouth. Amanda did not have patience for buts. She found people who could do the work and watched as a clerk, small and apologetic, fired up a station that hummed with the ache of other people's secrets. The feeds were a dozen frames at once, corridors, elevators, the brittle geometry of a place where hope and indifference rubbed shoulders. The footage from that long-ago night was grainy, the kind of gray that turned faces into shapes and gestures into intentions. Still, in the periphery of the frame, a movement would be enough. They scrolled. Amanda learned to hold still the way you keep hold of a rope in storm. Her fingers bunched under her palm until her knuckles went white. The clip blinked like a pulse and then began. Nurses moving, machines hissing, the blur of feet. A tray passed below the camera, and a hand that looked uncannily like Amaka's, a bracelet glinting plain as if it had been placed there to ensure recognition, slid an infant swaddled in a plain blue blanket from one cart to another. The image tilted, and the camera caught the profile of a man bent over that infant, Dr. Edbami. The face was not close enough for certainty, but the way he moved, the way he pocketed something after the exchange, cash, paper, hung in the black between frames like an accusation. Amanda's throat closed. Her hand flew to her mouth, and she tasted salt that was not hers. Around her, people moved in muted ways, professional and superstitious, as if they feared sound could erase what they had seen. The clerk's face did not hide his discomfort. People in archives dealt with lost years and unmade wrongs, but what they do not like is the sound of the past answering back. "Pause," Amanda said, voice small and absolute. Every sentence she had trained herself to say in boardrooms came now in breathing measured out of fear. "Rewind. Go back. Zoom." The grainy picture folded into itself obediently, and the bracelet flashed again. It was Amaka's, unmistakable if you had ever seen it. Its little charm looped like a bell. Amanda did not know if a bracelet was proof. Proof is a lawyer's word, and footage could be doctored. But a bracelet in a blurry frame landed like a stone in the center of her life. Behind the monitor, the clerk tapped a phone, and the words he used were careful. "We'll need a formal request," he said. There would be protocols. There would be hands to grease, permissions to pull. It would not be immediate, the world reminded her gently. Protocols are comfort to systems. Amanda sat with the image like a wound she could press her ear to and listen. The world outside the hospital had not yet noticed the way her life had cracked open. The rumor in the market would still say what it had been saying: scandal, impossibility. But what it did not know was the scandal was not the headline. The scandal was a family's quiet theft savaged by small, perfectly executed decisions. She stepped away from the monitor and did what she had not done in years. She summoned an arresting calm. First actions matter in the face of treachery. They are the grammar in which justice will be written. She called her lawyer, a man who smelled of old books and new ink. She ordered tests. She set the gears in motion with the same clarity she had always used when moving fortunes. Money could not erase a theft, but it ensured the wheels turned fast enough to catch someone. Outside the hospital doors, the city glowed in layers, markets, bars, a life that would keep going when their lives had altered. Inside, the past and present were cross-cutting with a terrific clarity. She began to sketch a list of demands: full archival retrieval, formal chain of custody for the footage, immediate hospital review. She would not let them wash this away with errors and protocols. But there were other urgencies. Chisholm's posture hardened the moment he learned of Amanda's insistence. He retreated into business-like calm, and then, in the margins, worked a different plan. Emma looked at him with the kind of uncertainty that betrays where his loyalties lay. Jacob, for reasons Amanda could not name, tightened his jaw and left without a word. Miriam stood at the periphery like a woman who had learned how to listen for what was not said. Her next actions would be crucial. She took Jacob's hand in a gesture that was more an offer than a command. "Tell me everything," she said. And there was no anger in it, the kind of request that could bring a man to undo himself. At the orphanage, Philip, who had learned to carry silence inside as if it were a treasure, moved through a different day. He had been told in small ways that the world would demand patience and cunning of him. That afternoon, he had fixed an old transistor radio for one of the older boys and had been rewarded with a half-baked bread and a smile. He did not yet know he was being traced by a woman with an empire. He did not yet feel how his small cleverness would one day bend toward recognition. Back in the hospital, Amanda demanded more. She was not naive. She knew footage could be timed out, could be lost by accident or neglect. She knew, in the brutal quiet of her soul, that money makes some people careful and others reckless. She knew also the most dangerous currency, a family secret that could, if exposed, destroy more than reputations. When the clerk finally handed her a copy, digital, grainy, a few stuttering frames that might make the most patient lawyer smile, Amanda's fingers trembled. The bracelet flashed, and for a moment a wind passed through the memory of that night. The picture did not say everything, it said enough. There is a particular vertigo that comes when a past action collides with two people's future. Amanda felt it as a pressure behind the eyes. This was not victory. This was not yet even accusation. It was a beginning. It made the house feel suddenly fragile, like a glass the size of a life walking into a room of careless children. She walked the corridors of her mansion that night like someone mapping the points of a compass. Peter slept in the next room. The sound of his breathing was a small, patient drum. Philip, if he were her son, was somewhere in the city she had never been forced to search. Jacob's absence was a hollowness that could not be fixed by anger alone. Amaka's possible guilt was a fact shadowed by motive and her sister's history of need. The phone rang, another step in a long chain of consequences. The voice on the line was soft, almost apologetic, and then it was not. "Mrs. Okoro, your request is being handled, but there are people asking questions about why you want this footage. We suggest caution." Amanda hung up. Caution had been what allowed the swap. Caution, in the wrong hands, was a planning room. If she learned one thing in the raid of that past night, it was that caution is a tool that can be wielded for kindness or cruelty. She walked to Peter's bedside and held his small hand. His fingers curled around her thumb, and he hummed a half-remembered lullaby. "Mama," he asked, and the word was both a condemnation and a benediction. Amanda pressed her forehead to his, and for the first time in a long while, she let herself imagine the shape of a future that accounted for both the child she had and the one she might yet find. There would be lawyers, there would be hospital administrators and security footage, and a list of people whose names would be inked onto papers that might or might not lead to prosecution. There would be small cruelties that required explanation. There would be a man who had been paid to look the other way, or perhaps had convinced himself he was the stronger on the deal, sleeping badly now, because money cannot erase conscience forever. Outside, in the place where gossip takes a face and a voice, the rumor would keep rolling.
Inside, the machinery of truth began to turn. Amanda knew how to hold power, not like a fist, but like careful hands that steady a ladder. She would climb it because the one thing she had learned in life was that silence can be the most dangerous kind of luxury. She did not yet know the shape of the courtrooms or the police files. She did not yet have DNA results. She did not yet understand how the man who had fathered the child, the poor mechanic with oil in his palms who had once loved her, would be forced into a role that he had never been prepared to play. She did not yet know if Miriam would forgive or rage, if Chisholm would crumble or thicken with devised lies, if Emma would choose to speak or find his refuge in silence. But she had a pixel of evidence, a bracelet in a frame, and the sound of a child's breath in the next room. Those were enough to make the night long and the next days full of shape. She would call Jacob. She would call Miriam. She would call the police. She would, in every way she could find, make the invisible clock of the past tick forward toward answer. And there, on an old hard drive in a hospital basement, a sequence of frames waited to be pulled into daylight. The grainy loop of an exchanged infant, a hand that matched no other, the glint of a charm like a small bell. These things conspired to pull open a seam in a family's life. Amanda stood in the doorway of her son's room and breathed. The night outside was honest in its blackness. Inside, plans unfurled, and people who had been small in her life began, quietly, to become enormous. Amanda moved with a surgeon's quiet. The grainy bracelet on a flickering screen had been a puncture wound. Now she would press the wound until the truth bled. She called the lawyer first, an old ally who still smelled of leather-bound files and impatience, and told him to mobilize every resource the name Okoro could buy without watering an already bitter throat. Then she called a detective she had once helped place into a promotion, a man who owed her nothing, and who, for reasons that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with a private distaste for cowardice, listened. By the time night softened into day, Amanda had created a constellation of urgency. Formal requests for archived footage, a demand for formal chain of custody to preserve any evidence, a polite but firm note to hospital administration that the family intended to press charges if the footage corroborated what she suspected. The words were careful: inquire, preserve, expedite.
But behind each one was an unsteady thing she hid even from herself, the fear that 5 years had hollowed someone out of her life for good. Jacob's phone rang twice before he answered. Amanda's voice on the line was a tempered instrument. She did not plead, she issued choices. He promised to come in the morning. He said he would tell Miriam. Later, when the call ended, Jacob did not move from the spot where he stood on the tiny porch of the house he had once shared with a different life. The bruise along his jaw had faded to a purple memory. The message it carried had not. Miriam watched Jacob's hesitation with a tough tenderness that had hardened into a rule. No more silence. She had learned to parse the language of men who had learned to survive under the authority of those who wielded fear like a rod. "Tell me now, Jacob," she said, when he finally walked through the kitchen door. Her hand found the ledger where the monthly bills were kept, the same book that had seen them through earlier hunger and would now see them through the seasoning of shame. He told her what he could. He left out as much as he could. Fear is a kind of language. And when he spoke of Chisholm's warnings and the men with knuckles thick as the palms of hammers, Miriam's eyes went to a place where compassion angered into calculation. "We go to the police," she said. "We do not hide." That was an ultimatum wrapped in a vow. Jacob agreed because the alternative, to join a conspiracy of silence, felt like dying small day by day. Across town, Dr. Ednia sat on a narrow bed in a rented flat that smelled of boiled potatoes and cheap incense. He had not slept. His hands trembled too much to form the small prayer he kept for his mother. His debts had been a slow violence, a hospital bill for a sick sister, a blackmail note he had received months before the exchange, a creditor who came at night. He had told himself the bribe he took was a bridge over water that would otherwise drown his family. That was what men tell themselves before shame begins to visit in the daylight. When the phone rang and a voice with a clipped authority asked him to come in, his first reaction was a hot animal panic. He imagined the ledger they might find, the paper trail that could make his life a litany of small betrayals. He dressed in a shirt that had survived one too many machine cycles and shaved with the attention of a man trying to make his face new. Amaka was somewhere else, practicing grief as if it were a speech she had to perfect. Her fingers worried the same bracelet Amanda had seen on the screen. She had never left it to chance because appearances were her currency. She had learned to make people see her as the sister wronged rather than the woman who orchestrated wrongs. She had a story, poverty, a betrayal that made cruelty necessary, and stories keep the guilty alive longer than law does. Meanwhile, at St. Mary's, the air had a sourness that came from too many bodies and not enough money. The orphanage kept time and tasks, sweeping at dawn, porridge ration at midday, prayer at dusk. Philip had grown into a boy who measured kindness in small denominations, an extra biscuit here, a moment of attention there. Sister Ife, who had been at St. Mary's, had dared to voice the pain that had followed the initial discovery. Mary's, longer than most county memos could remember, watched Philip with a grandmother's aloofness but a caregiver's ferocity. She had noticed him from the first. There are children who arrive and stay in the corner of one's eye as if they carry a quiet insistence that one day they will need rescue. When Amanda's team arrived at the orphanage, it was with the force of a storm. Police officers in neat shirts, a solicitor who had Joanna's lines learned in a whisper, and Sister Ife's curious, exhausted face. The officers were polite but blunt. They had been shown the hospital footage. The bracelet that glinted on a grainy frame was enough for a formal inquiry. Someone produced a photograph of a child whose features, under a dozen filters, matched a face Amanda had not seen in half a decade. Philip sat on a bench mending a torn football. His hands knew the language of small repairs. He looked up because someone called his name. Someone with the kind of voice that cut through the lightness of the day and altered the entire architecture of attention. The officer crouched and asked a question that was both simple and monstrous. "Do you know who your parents are?" He shook his head slowly. The question landed like a cold hand. Amanda watched from aside, steadier than she felt, while a woman in a uniform explained that they needed to take a sample for DNA. The procedure was clinical, a cheek swab, paperwork signed and witnessed. It felt like the exchange of small fortunes. The boy gave saliva, and with it a possibility. The state gave a temporary promise of truth. Back at the hospital, Dr. Admi had learned of the footage and the ledger that might exist. Confrontation is a precise instrument. Those who live by small betrayals are rarely surprised by their own discovery. He walked into the police station with the slow gait of someone who had expected corrections to arrive one day. Under interrogation lights, he spoke in fragments. Greed, he admitted. Fear, he admitted. Money changing hands, he admitted. The idea that his actions had sent a living child into a cramped dormitory and left another boy with eyes that would never open without surgery made his voice hollow. "What did you think would happen?" Detective Kalu asked, not unkindly. Kalu had the voice of someone who had asked the same question to men who hid behind different excuses. "Did you believe a child's life was a ledger entry?" Admi's eyes were rimmed with sleep, and for a while he said nothing. Then, with a smallness that was almost prayer, he began to name names. He described a woman who wore consolation like a shawl, a maca, and the way cash had passed over trays like an ordinary ember. He described how in the shadows, signatures had been altered by hands that wanted speed and no witnesses. He signed a page that would become part of a file that smelled like institutional mildew and tobacco. It was not full confession. It was a practical admission that would shape the immediate architecture of justice. In the mansion, Chisholm felt the walls press in. The news moved like a shiver. He paced the drawing room, mapping exits and calls and possible lines of defense. He had never expected Amanda to act like a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. He had assumed the fear he had cultivated would be a moat enough to shield his family. He had misjudged her muscle. Emma, who had been quieter than the trees in a storm, watched the way Chisholm learned to harden his face. "We hold," he said once, simple as an edict. "We tell the story of a mother willing to accept the grief of a blind child. We make grief the shield." Emma's voice had the brittle conviction of someone who wanted to believe his survival required someone else's silence. Then the police came for them. Arrests are procedural things, carefully scripted to minimize violence and maximize evidence. Officers in plain clothes, with warrants signed by a magistrate, moved efficiently. Amaka was the first to be formally told she was in custody. Her face remained composed in the fluorescent light, like a woman who had learned to look unbroken even when she was unraveling. Chisholm and Emma were taken into separate rooms for questioning. Dr. Admi sat on a chair that made him look smaller than he had been that morning. At St. Mary's, the DNA results were a story in miniature. Forensic teams do not speak in absolutes in the way a tabloid demands. They speak in probabilities and percentages. The lab phoned at a time when twilight made the windows look like black eyes. The technician on the other end of the line was careful. Preliminary match, very strong likelihood that Philip is biologically related to Amanda Okoro. We still recommend a confirmatory test, but the probability values are high. Chain of custody was observed at the collection. Amanda pressed her palm to the glass of the park bench they had chosen for the meeting. She felt the world tilt. Not every part of her body responded the way she'd expected. There was a strange, almost alien tenderness she had not anticipated, like the slow thaw inside a place that had not been allowed sunlight. When the detective told her, she could not speak. Her throat held a knot. Philip had been a rumor in her bones for 5 years. The evidence had finally given that rumor a face. The reunion was not clean. It never is. Philip did not leap into her arms at first. He had been taught caution, to test generosity, because this world demanded it. He stepped closer with the measured curiosity of someone who notes features as instruments, Amanda's ring, the cadence of her voice. She had a moment when she wanted to collapse into the kind of sob that dissolves a person into truth, but instead she reached out and let the boy take her hand. His palm was calloused and small, his fingers curled around hers like a thing finding shelter. Peter watched from a doorway, his face a study in the kind of incomprehension that belongs to small children. He had been taught that families expand to hold more love, but he also knew the particular rhythms that held his life bordered, a routine, a warmth at certain hours, a certain kind of attention. The arrival of a boy who looked like a borrowed version of a story would rearrange bindings inside him, but he did not yet have the language for the ache. Amanda brought both boys home in a procession that felt like an altar. The household, staff, a few neighbors, a lawyer, watched with something like awe. Philip kept his hands busy, carrying the small plastic football he had patched, as if possession could anchor him while the world tilted. Peter held to Amanda's sleeve as if the world could be mended by proximity. The police filed charges: kidnapping, conspiracy, corruption. The words hung in the air like court summonses. Amaka was formally charged with the offenses and placed in custody. Chisholm and Emma were charged as accomplices, and Dr. Admi was charged with corruption and aiding and abetting. The prosecutor was careful in phrasing, no verdicts declared, only the machinery engaged. Amanda stood where she could see the men who had been at the center of her family's fracture and felt a complex thing, vindication threaded with the bitter knowledge that paper could not repair time. Amaka's demeanor did not crack in the corridor of the courthouse. When she saw Amanda, the two women held eye contact the way two fighters assess the next move. Amaka's voice when it reached Amanda was a whisper that might have been a prayer or a threat. "This is not the end," she mouthed. The words landed like a seed. Inside a police interview room, Chisholm fumbled for a defense that had the weight of reason. He spoke of obligations he had been taught since childhood, the loyalty to family, the necessity of keeping resources where they would be used wisely, meaning in his mind with him at the center. He described the house as an inheritance that needed guardians, and he painted Amanda's actions as capricious and dangerous. The detective who listened had the patience of someone who had watched men try to justify cruelty in soft language. "You are not the only one who remembers being fed by hunger," he said. "You are accountable for your choices." Emma, in another room, broke. He could not carry disloyalty as if it were clean. It had stained him. He described how Chisholm had coerced staff and watched Peter with a scrutiny that turned play into a test. He spoke of a moment when he had almost stopped the fall down the stairs, but chose silence because he feared for himself. The confession was a small, terrible thing. It cleared a space in the air for truth, even if it could not repair old wounds. Back at the mansion, Mariam's arrival was a collision of relief and anger. She had come with hands that knew how to wash away dirt and mouths that had practiced the names of small saints. She looked at Philip with something like disbelief and then with a fierce ownership. "You are my son's blood," she told the boy with a voice that made him flinch and then fold into the warmth of a maternal claim he had not expected. Jacob watched from the shadows of the doorway. His chest ached with a mourning that had the shape of what might have been, and the dangerous, sharp hope of what might yet be. The living arrangements that followed were messy and tender. Legal advisors argued with the restraint of lawyers and the ferocity of people who understand how adhesive courts can be. Temporary guardianship papers were drawn, social workers gave their assessments, and an urgent medical appointment was scheduled for Philip to assess health gaps from years in a resource-starved environment. Peter would continue under Amanda's daily care, but the legal line between the two boys' statuses remained bright with questions. Philip watched the mansion as if it were a new country. The marble floor was a wide river of strange reflections. He learned quickly how to hold cutlery without grimacing, how to wash his hands in a faucet that expelled warm water without the need to ration. He liked the way Amanda hummed while she moved through the kitchen. He liked the small brass bell she kept for late-night calls to staff. He also, quietly, liked the closet that housed all the toys he had once seen in the kind of stories the orphanage heard about wealthy people. His fingers traced the seams of his football until the sound of washing machines and the distant click of shutters became a different kind of music. Peter, who had been made intimately fluent with Amanda's body and its movements, had to build a map where a new brother had to share space and scent. He did this in small ways. He taught Philip a lullaby he had learned from Amanda, translating its cadence into syllables for a boy who had eyes that saw but had not been taught to read the contours in darkness. Philip listened and learned. The two boys began, awkwardly and with the careful politeness of those who have been taught to survive, to cover the same floor with their feet. One evening, Amanda found Miriam in the kitchen, fingers wrapped around a mug, the steam like a halo slipping toward the ceiling. The two women sat across from one another, an oasis of conversation in a house that had become a courtroom of sorts. Miriam's hatred for what had been done to her family had hardened into resolve. She looked at Jacob and then at Amanda as if weighing the scale of blame and forgiveness. "I needed him to be the man I thought he could be," Miriam confessed, in a small voice that revealed the ache of someone who had loved imperfectly. "I wanted him to be present for our son." Amanda listened. Her own missteps were private and legible only to her. She had toyed with the idea that love could be reclaimed purely by presence. "We are all undone by our choices," Amanda said finally. "We can choose now whether we will be made better by them or bent by them." The trial of public opinion moved in paralleled currents. Reporters had started to tack their microphones to the edges of courthouses and market squares. Someone somewhere, always someone, had a phone and would always have a theory. Rumors, as Amanda had once learned, can be persistent weeds. She kept her head down in the way of people who knew how to keep a private life from leaking into a headline, but she could not hide the tenderness that had begun to stitch itself into her days. She hummed lullabies while making tea, and sometimes she would find herself catching a boy who had been struggling with the shape of a word in his mouth. Dr. Adme, when released on limited bail, retreated into a life of small atonements. He made calls to families he had harmed, to the people he had promised things to in the small, greedy hours. He began to speak to his own children more, and to the hospital staff in a new way that sought to make up for what money had bought him. It was not forgiveness he expected. It was the only way he knew to breathe again. He lingered at the gates of the hospital and watched the world, remembering the patient faces he had seen, the ones that had been eased into night by small kindnesses. He kept a ledger and wrote in it by hand the names of bills he would pay once the case was settled. Amaka, meanwhile, sat in a small cell and practiced a different logic. Her attorneys were working. She received visitors who spoke of rights and of the possibility of spinning a narrative that made her into a victim. She worked this narrative like someone who arranges coins on a table and wonders which will catch the light. Behind her composure, she nursed the ferocity of someone who, until the moment the police handcuffs clicked, had believed she had engineered a mercy. But there were fractures around her. Chisholm, removed from the house and now in custody, felt exposed as a man who had counted on shadows. He had been the muscle of a plan he had not always fully understood. In interrogation, he alternated between swagger and panic, the two like weather in a storm. He reached for threats he thought might still work, silent calls, implied harm, but the net had closed and calls went unanswered. In a rare moment alone, displeasure replaced bravado, and he paced until the concrete smelled like the ocean of coolness that settles when men sit too long with their choices. Emma, seeking redemption, cooperated. He provided names, described transactions and small coercions, and how staff had been bribed with envelopes that smelled of laundry. He told investigators about a nurse who had been promised a sum in exchange for keeping silent, and about a records clerk who had been persuaded to fudge paperwork. Names leaked like heat through frost, and with each name came a diagram of complicity. The hospital, chastened, conducted an internal review. The administration offered statements that were careful and contrite. They promised tightened policies, enhanced CCTV retention, improved oversight. Amanda read their press release and felt the warm, faint echo of institutional apology. Useful, but in many ways a cold and tidy thing. She wanted a life restored, more than coins of apology. She had won a legal foothold, but every person walked away with something less than the life they had had before. She would have to teach two boys how to be brothers in the same house where theft had been done. Medical attention for Philip was urgent and tender. Years without screened nutrition and regular pediatric care left traces, a slight delay in height, a stomach that occasionally protested richer food, and the way he blinked at light with a sensitivity no child should have to learn. The doctors recommended a series of screenings and a program of rehabilitation, speech therapy to fill in gaps, vaccinations, and the gentle, patient work of letting a child discover that a bathroom can hold hot water and soap as a joy rather than as a luxury. Peter's therapy began too. The fall left a bruise that healed into a scar, but the emotional wound required different stitches. He had learned to answer Amanda's calls in ways that had trained him to be small in presence, to avoid stirring whispers. Now he had to be taught to share attention and to trust that the boy who now lived in his home was not a rival, but a brother. Amanda hired a counselor who specialized in childhood trauma and attachment. The man arrived with a notepad and a voice that moved like warm honey. He taught them games that helped Peter see in ways that were not only visual, games of sound localization, of touch mapping, of learning to navigate a room with playful confidence. There were public moments where sympathy met judgment. Some voices in the market cast aspersions. How could a woman of 65 conceive? Others argued about morality in ways that made Amanda feel like a relic from a world unwilling to measure the complexity in another's life. She turned away from that noise and toward the radio of the house that hummed low and comforting, toward the laughter that started small and then erupted one afternoon when Peter and Philip both discovered the delight of building a fort out of cushions. But not everything mended in the warmth of domestic building. There remained a file drawer of resentments, the arrest records, the hospital ledger, the police statements. There were also whispers of more grave, deliberate schemes. Detective Kalu stumbled on a ledger that suggested the bribes had not been one-off gestures, but part of a longer pattern. Other files, other exchanges, maybe other children. The possibility spread a chill along Amanda's spine like a current. Had 5 years simply revealed one night of theft, or had it been part of a larger machinery where children were traded and decisions were made by people who saw human lives as accounting entries? The question went uncomfortably unanswered and became the engine for what would come next. Amanda, who had once made decisions over investments and expansions, now found her nights filled with lists, people to interview, names to vet, a careful plan to wash the stain of complicity out of institutions that had allowed a child to be moved like cargo. It was practical crusading and also something akin to penance, an attempt to ensure the future carried fewer quiet horrors. Outside, in a cell that smelled like disinfectant and the iron tang of waiting, Amaka sat with hands folded. A guard came to take her to a visitation room. When the door opened, she saw a woman who, by title, was Amanda's counsel. The woman sat down and asked questions gently, with a kindness that forced Amaka to move like a limb she had not used. "What do you want?" she asked, the phrase unmoored. Amaka's answer was not a confession, it was a promise that sounded like a threat. "They think they have the whole thing," she said, "but there are pieces they don't see." She paused, and then, with the clarity of a person who had rehearsed the contours of the conversation for years, she said, "You will find that not every ledger tells the whole story." The lawyer took that as a legalistic maneuver and nothing more. Amanda watched the exchange from the gallery of the courthouse, where sound traveled thick with the smell of paper. She, who had been in charge of empires, learned there are always more rooms that lock than there are keys she could keep. She had found a boy, but there might be more stories hidden like seeds. There was still, amid the practical chaos, a small residency of tenderness. One afternoon, the three of them, Amanda, Philip, and Peter, sat in the sunroom where the light made the floor a field of gold. Philip showed Peter how to hold a toy car so it sang down the ramp they had built out of cushions. Peter, who had been cautious with touch, found the impulse of delight and began to laugh with the sort of abandon that loosens something inside Amanda's chest. She watched them and felt a tenderness she had not realized hunger for, an ache like the one that had brought her to the hospital 5 years before. It was a different hunger now, and its answer was a slow, messy, incandescent kind of repair. Yet, as night came, Amanda remained the kind of woman who turned over problems like pages. There was an envelope left by an old clerk who had worked in hospital records, a small packet of photocopies with names and dates, and on one page, a signature she had seen before. The signature matched a ledger that had been tucked away in the bottom of Dr. Odme's medical bag when he had been arrested. It was enough to show that the swap had not been as isolated as they had first feared. Detective Kalu called Amanda late one night. His voice was tired but tight with a promise. "We have a preliminary set of names," he said, "and one more thing. A call traced to a number that seems to connect to an address you and I should visit in person." They went in the gray of dawn. The address was a low building that had once advertised itself as a care facility, but whose paint had peeled with time. Inside, the room smelled of bleach and forgotten promises. A single file cabinet stood in a back room, and behind a false bottom, a series of folders hid like papyri. They contained records of children who had been moved, visitor logs that had been altered, and most disturbingly, a list of payments made to a number that tracked back to a small, defunct charitable trust with ties to people who had sat on hospital boards. That night, when Amanda returned to the mansion and found the two boys in bed, breathing steadily, she sat by the window and let the city move past like a river. Justice had begun its work, but she knew in her bones that the most delicate repairs would take time. A courtroom did not make a child whole. A police file could not stitch together the years of a childhood missed. But the wheels were in motion, and that, in its own quiet way, was a scaffold on which they could begin to build. Her phone buzzed. The message was simple: "Visitor at 10." She did not know what this meant at first, only that the day would return with another challenge. She walked to the boys' rooms and for a moment simply listened. 70 small suburban heartbeats beat against the hush of late night. She touched the boys' foreheads like a benediction and felt an honest exhaustion, and a sudden tiny sound, barely audible, that suggested she was being watched. On the kitchen table lay a small device, an old mobile phone with a screen clouded by finger marks, left there by mistake. It vibrated and lit up. The caller ID was an unknown number, but its pattern made Amanda's throat tighten. One of the numbers traced in the hospital's old ledger. Her lawyer had told her to expect anything. The device vibrated again. Across town, Amaka sat in her visitation booth and watched a certain filmed segment on the television where Amanda's face was softened by sympathy. She moved her lips without sound and rehearsed a sentence she had kept in an inside pocket all week. "You have not seen everything." The eyes of the woman who had been called a sister carried the small, dangerous glint of someone who believed secrets were still a currency. The phone on Amanda's kitchen table died with a final, small click. It was a trivial thing, technically, but it left in its absence a small sense of imminent movement. Somewhere, there were gears still turning. Conversations that had been buried awaited their surface. People Amanda trusted and people she suspected would be compelled to speak. The net had closed around several of the central figures in the night of the swap, but in making the world safe for one child, she might have stirred other, older schemes. Amanda rose and looked at the two sleeping boys in their rooms. They lay like shapes of possibility. One who had grown up inside her house, the other who had been rescued from a pile of untended rations and taught to be small. The law would sort out custody, and the press would have its day, and doctors would prescribe routines. But the deeper work, the remapping of attachments, the patient lesson that time does not only steal, but can also begin to repair, was left to the quiet hours. She pressed her forehead to the window and watched the city breathe. The bracelet had been a small revelation. The DNA had been a confirming hand. Arrests had been made and cuffs had clicked. But as a woman who had spent a lifetime moving masses of money and influence, she knew the arc of justice is sometimes slow and messy. The children would need more than courts. They would need patient, sometimes provisional love. On the far side of the city, in a visiting room where light fell in a rectangle across a table, Amaka leaned forward and said something with the kind of cold finality that can chill even the hardest hearts. "We had reasons," she said. And then, softer, meant for a private ear, "and you will learn what those reasons cost." Her visitor left the room with a face like a closed door. That night, someone outside the city made a call to a number that had been dormant. The voice on the other end answered like satisfying the pull on something taut. Amanda turned away from the window and, with a steadiness that had been carved out of grief and choice, sat down at her desk. She opened the ledger where she kept names, and under the folds she began to write a new list of tasks. Confirmatory DNA, social worker reports, school enrollment for Philip, therapy schedules for Peter, secure the house's perimeter, check the staff's bank accounts, ask HR for statements, file motions for emergency custody arrangements, consult with the prosecutor about other possible sites to search. There would be court appearances, and there would be nights when the idea of waking to another headline felt like living inside a storm. But there was also the small domestic miracle happening in the rooms where two boys slept, a brotherhood stitching itself in games and shared meals, and the recitation of a lullaby both had learned by different means. As dawn rose again, Amanda pressed the edge of a paper and circled a name. Detective Kalu's voice had been steady when he left. "This is only the beginning." Amanda knew he was right. Justice had begun to move, but it moved in human hands that erred and in institutions that had to be pressed to perform their nobler functions. She walked through the mansion and passed by a series of portraits, faces that had preserved their legacies in wax and oil. For a long time, she had believed permanence was a product of wealth and reputation. Now she knew permanence was a fragile thing that must be protected by action and not merely assumed. She opened the nursery door and watched Peter sleep, his small chest rising and falling, and felt an untransactional love that no ledger could measure. Outside, a rumor that had once been a thrown stone now rolled into another rumor. But under it all, something more substantive had happened. A boy had been returned to his family, and two families would now have to relearn each other in the same home. Detective Kalu stood for a long time outside the courthouse bench, watching a late commuter make his way down the marble steps. "They will try to spin it," he told Amanda when she joined him, "but if you keep asking the right questions, we'll find the answers." He had a file under his arm and a patience that had grown out of experience. Amanda's grip on the file she now held was less about triumph than about the steady insistence of someone who understands that unmaking an old wrong can be quieter work than celebrating a sudden right. The case would move through hearings, evidence would be laid out, motives would be parsed in public. Some hearts would harden, others would soften. And somewhere in that arc, a young mechanic who had once kissed Amanda under streetlights and watched as life demanded he choose a harder path would be pulled into a role he had never chosen: father. Jacob, who had once been the poor mechanic with oil on his palms and love in his pockets, arrived at the mansion one evening, weary but resolute. He found Philip in the sunroom, trying to balance a radio he had repaired and learning how to tune it without breaking it again. When Philip looked up and saw him, something like recognition moved through the boy's face. Jacob reached out, hands trembling, and placed his palm over the small hand of the boy who might be his son. He did not speak at first. He let the contact do the work words could not. Miriam watched, and then, with a breath that was part surrender and part acceptance, moved to stand beside him. "We will try," she said, and the sentence had all the gravity of a treaty. When the arrests were finally public and the charges read aloud in a courtroom where cameras blinked like watchful insects, Amaka's calm masked a deeper desert. She kept gathering words the way a hoarder keeps items against a flood. Her warning, "This is not the end," was not merely bravado. There were names not yet read into notebooks, files not yet found in the dark rooms of bureaucracies, and perhaps other children whose pasts had been made to vanish. As everything tightened into a new order, Amanda chose to stand in the middle of it, not as a queen issuing decrees, but as a mother who had to hold two boys brought together by a brutal twist of fate. She would attend hearings. She would organize legal strategies. She would, in quiet hours, teach a blind boy how to find comfort and a rescued boy how to belong. She would also, with the sharp economical generosity of someone who had rebuilt empires, ensure that the rectification did not end in a quiet burying of consequences. Names would be called. People would be questioned. If the machinery of justice had holes, she would press her weight into those gaps until light passed through. There was one last small moment before dusk where everything seemed suspended. Amanda held Philip's small face in her hands and looked into eyes that had learned suspicion and were now being taught to trust again. "You are not alone," she told him, softly. The boy who had learned to be small swallowed the words like a new diet. Peter hovered at the edge and then bravely reached over and took Philip's hand. It was a small, exquisite act that settled a nest of fears for a moment. On the courthouse steps, Amaka's face was picked out by the flashbulbs of a waiting press. She made a small movement that could have been a smile or a way of arranging her mask of grief. In her pocket, a folded scrap of paper lay like a seed she had not yet planted. A jail visitor pocketed a number that would not be spoken aloud in public, but would be put into motion in rooms where they kept things lit by dim lamps. Amanda watched the procession of reporters and officers and felt the long haul ahead. She knew the next months would be a calculus of therapy appointments and court calendars and bruised reputations. She knew, too, that amid the bureaucracy, the daily acts, the building of tents and living rooms, the relearning to trust hands, the measuring of medicine doses and school timetables would be the true work. She walked home with the taste of new, careful hope on her tongue. The house hummed with the small noises of people who rose in the morning to make their living. Kettles, the creak of a bench, the laughter of boys learning a new game. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself a private vision of a future where these sounds were as ordinary as breath. Then, sitting at her desk, she unfolded the little scrap of paper that had come inside an envelope during the day's commotion. On it was written a single name she did not yet know how to place, and a number she recognized as belonging to a dispensary that serviced distant clinics. She circled it and placed it into the file she had begun to keep. There would be more names. There would be more nights where the house felt like the epicenter of a reverberation. There would also be mornings where two boys would build forts and invented worlds would take precedence over legal filings. That was the tension that would drive the next chapter of their lives. The ordinary miracles of shared breakfast and scraped knees, and the extraordinary labor of untangling systems that had allowed a child's life to be traded like an entry in an account book. Detective Kalu promised to follow every lead. Amanda promised herself she would not allow the story to fade into another headline. Philip and Peter would be given their days back in the only way the world could provide, by people who would be present, by professionals who would heal where needed, and by a family determined to make the long, patient repair. When night finally gathered itself around the mansion, Amanda went to the nursery one more time. The boys slept side by side, one with the memory of neglect folded into his limbs, the other with a blindness that had taught him to feel the world with greater care. She kissed their foreheads and whispered promises she meant to keep, that she would fight for them in the courts, that she would teach them tenderness in the days, that she would be present when the world tried to put price tags back onto human lives. She left the window open a crack. Somewhere, the city continued to move, full of people making decisions that would ripple in ways none of them could fully know. Somewhere in a cell, Amaka turned and spoke those words again with a carefully composed cruelty. Not everything is found. But Amanda, who had watched the past answer for itself on a monitor and seen bracelets glint into evidence, did not flinch. She had learned that truth, once given a place to breathe, seldom stayed hidden forever. Outside, a phone vibrated in a dark pocket. Someone answered and said without hurry, "We need to talk about the others." The voice was even, old with knowledge. Inside the mansion, a soft, steady chorus of breathing filled the rooms where two boys dreamt. And for the first time in 5 years, their dreams brushed one another like the tentative edges of a new map. If you're following Amanda's story, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Comment below who you think is most responsible for the betrayal and who must be forgiven. There would be more hearings, there would be longer investigations, there would be moments of grace and moments of sharp recrimination. The arrests were not the end, they were the hinge. Someone would, as the weeks unfolded, make an unexpected decision. A record would surface in a drawer in a hospital basement. A name would be called that would change the scale of the inquiry. And in the quiet of the mansion, Amanda would continue to do what she did best: build the scaffolding for a future where two boys could grow into men who would not be defined by a theft, but by the love and choices that followed.